Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for a great morning so far. We're going to go ahead and get started with our keynote presentation this afternoon. So I'd like to introduce you all to Marlon Peterson, our keynote speaker for the day. We're very grateful for him being here. Marlon is the founder and chief reimaginator of the Precedential Group, a social justice consulting firm, and a 2015 recipient of the prestigious Soros Justice Fellowship. Ebony Magazine has named Marlon one of America's 100 most influential and inspiring leaders in the Black community. He's also an Aspen Ideas Festival scholar. Marlon spent his entire 20s inside of New York State prisons for his involvement as a crime and as a teenager. During that time, he earned an associate's degree in criminal justice with honors. He spent the last 5 years of his incarceration as the head of the Transitional Services Center, where he created programming and curricula for men nearing release from incarceration. He also spearheaded and designed an experiential workshop for incarcerated men and college students from Vassar College called Vassar and Otisville, two communities bridging the gap. Marlon graduated from New York University with a Bachelor of Science with a concentration on organizational behavior. His writings have appeared in Ebony, Gawker, The Nation, The Crime Report, Black Press USA, Huffington Post, and other online publications. He's contributed to Kiese Lehman's award-winning novel, How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America, and Love Lives Here Too by former New York Times columnist Sheila Rule. He resides in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and lives by the hashtag #BePrecedential. Please help me welcome Marlon Peterson.
Hello? Yes. All right. My mic sound nice? How y'all doing? So first of all, I want to thank you all for allowing me to be in your space. I came a long way, all the way from Brooklyn, New York, so I appreciate you all for the hospitality, particularly Alan Detlef, Connie Warren, and Rania Butler. They are some of the nicest people I've met. I go a lot of places, and their hospitality has been phenomenal. This talk that I'm gonna give today, let me just pull this up, is gonna be a personal talk. And I kinda hope that you are okay with that. The issues that we are dealing with as started this morning are very, as we think about these things statistically, the numbers are stark, and we'll get into that during the talk, but these numbers are actual people. As we think about actual people, these are actual lives. So when I speak about these issues, I speak with the understanding that I'm speaking about actual people, I'm speaking about myself. And I hope you're okay with the personal nature of this talk. So last year was a very tough year for me. And I plan to tell you all about it in this talk. It was actually the toughest year of my life since I was locked up. And I know that it was difficult for me because my skin told me, my hair told me, and my lies told me. I created another prison, and prisons do not work. I do not believe in the usefulness of prisons of any kind. Let me tell you why. So anyway, anyone here ever had eczema? You ain't gotta show me your evidence, but so for me, so it started around last March or April, and it actually began on my shins, on my legs. And that's where I first got it, actually back around 2007 when I was in prison. About 7 or 8 years into my bid in 2007, I began scratching my legs and scratching, and scratching. I know you're eating, but until the blood. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was the detergent that they were washing our clothes with. I thought it was some bad lotion from the commissary. I didn't have WebMD to Google to figure out what it was. So one day, as I was in the gym playing basketball with my boy Horse, and so Horse was a husky young dude. He was blood, not my blood, he was blood. And he was someone I cared for because I knew that he was hiding inside of a shell that he liked to call Horse. He was a young knucklehead who liked bullying people. And usually, he was also very impressionable and parading violence. And I mean parading violence, he was just parading violence if you could figure out that he was really trying to hide. He was a friend of mine. I was a big brother to him, and he was like a little brother to me. One day we were playing ball in the gym when he said, "What the fuck happened to your leg? You got hit with shrapnel or something?" Now my slow ass wasn't quite sure what shrapnel was, but through the context of his statement, I could figure out that he was saying something was wrong with the way my legs looked. I felt self-conscious like a mug. I signed up for sick call, and in sick call, at least in New York State prisons, is the prison version of going to the local clinic. The main difference between the sick call and the local clinic, though, is that in sick call, you only get to complain about one medical issue at a time. And mine, luckily, I had, at least I thought, one medical issue. So without giving me a diagnosis, this doctor prescribed me some sort of cream to relieve the itching. And after using it for a couple of weeks with no improvement in my condition, I went back to sick call. This time, the doctor arranged that I go to an outside hospital to see what was really wrong. And at this visit, they gave me a biopsy to check if I had cancer. Thankfully, it was not cancer. But the doctor at that point diagnosed me with having eczema, something I had never heard of in my life. He gave me some more cream to relieve the itching. Eventually, the itching subsided, but not without the scars. It would be years after my release in 2009 before I'd wear short pants, shorts, or anything of that nature because I wanted to hide the shrapnel marks tattooed on my legs. It would be years before I'd begin to realize that the emotional scars of incarceration were enabling me to maintain the invisible prisons that has conditioned so many of us to refuse to see that prisons of any kind only add harm. Last year, the eczema came back with a vengeance unlike I'd ever seen, from head to toe, from toe to head. My hair started falling out, thus the wonderful hat. Last year also happened to be the year I found myself in another prison. I found myself in a prison of self-deceit. I'm a terrible liar. I can lie well, but I can't emotionally conceal the weight of maintaining this deception. It stresses me out. I discovered that about myself over the past year and a half. I lied to someone I care deeply about, someone who did nothing wrong to deserve the fragility masked by dishonesty. They decided they wanted nothing to do with me, and that hurt. But what hurt more, what brought on depression, suicidal ideations, distress-induced eczema, hair loss, and therapy wasn't her discovering my lies, but my avoidance of the person in the mirror. I looked okay physically, but the windows of my eyes were stained beyond recognition. I could not bear to see myself or the ways in which I was harming an underserved bystander to my own selfish desire to look like I was being truthful. Dishonesty is a prison that requires energy, time, and focus in authenticity. The longer the lies maintained, the more harm it will cause to everyone who becomes a victim of that lie. This October, I will celebrate my 40th birthday. 10 years since my release, and sadly 20 years since my arrest, and this was my 20th nor 30th birthday at home. Prison was hell. There's not one day I did not wish to be free, which led me to this image on the screen. Now this quote here is from my final entry into my journal. I kept a journal for the entire decade that I was away. And this is actually literally the last word. You see the picture behind the actual quote. You can't see it too well, but I'll read it out for you. No drugs, no gangs, smarter, wiser, more secure, a better man, stronger family ties, better friends. I've conquered prison. I will be successful, I will break barriers, I will inspire, I will because it is what I ought to do. And if you didn't know anything about the Bible, look at the scripture in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. Yeah, my sabbatical is finished. My new life begins, stay tuned. So I had conquered prison, mostly. I highlighted that sentence about conquering prison because I thought prison was a thing to be fought and battled. It was the closest thing to actually having a boot on your neck. Surviving there intact required a personal strategy. Maintaining a sense of dignity was strenuous, and rarely did this battle have anything to do with the physical violence that's also a part of prison life. Several years into my sentence, I was transferred from a maximum security prison to a medium security prison. And when you're transferred from one prison to the other, you kind of like got to start all over again. And when I say start all over, part of what you have to do is also get any phone numbers that you may have had on your list, any visitors that you may have had who are on a approved list to come visit you. You have to send that list all over again to get approved by the prison administrators. And the person that did it was a prison counselor, who in theory, their job is to help you out with some level of case management throughout your time inside. So I'd asked for an appointment to meet with my corrections counselor at this new prison. His name is Mr. Rocha, middle-aged white man with glasses. I was escorted to this office waiting area on this particular day. And at that time, I didn't know what he looked like. But there were other men in the waiting area who knew what he looked like, and so they would point him out to me when he came out. So eventually this counselor came out, the guys let me know, there's Mr. Rocha. So I walked up to him, I said, excuse me, Mr. Rocha? He said, yes, I am. I said, hi, I'm Mr. Peterson. And before I can get another word out, he cut me off and he said, you're not Mr. Peterson, you're inmate Peterson. Without question, at that moment, to be quite honest, I felt like spitting in his face. Of course, I did not do that. I understood the repercussions behind doing that. But it did take me back to an early experience in prison when I kind of really understood what prison was meant to do. It wasn't a system intended to rehabilitate. It wasn't a creation to encourage penitence, of which the word penitentiary derives. Prison wasn't built to compel its residents to feel remorse or regret about whatever got them or me in there in the first place. Prison was a place, as abolitionist and scholar Andrew Davis said, jails and prisons are designed to break human beings, to convert the populations into specimens in the zoo. How would reminding me that I am less than him, an inmate, encourage me or anyone to repair or rehabilitate whatever broken part of us allowed us to commit an act of harm in the first place, especially someone like me who was locked up for a violent offense. Last year, I, along with a cohort of activists and advocates from around the country and South Africa, visited a museum in Selma, Alabama. And this particular museum provided people with like a simulation of what the breaking of a person looked like, of a slave looked like, particularly as folks were now coming from Africa into America. Now, we opted to participate in this simulation, so there was a lot of yelling and cussing at us, over-the-top cussing, trying to really simulate that experience from slave, quote-unquote, slave overseers, who slave overseers were also, in many cases, white and black. After the simulation was over, the tour guide asked us for feedback. And this is where you get to some audience participation. So they asked for some feedback, and I offered some feedback. What do you think I said when they asked me for feedback? I said, I know exactly what this is like. I've been through this before. The only difference is that it was called reception. So after I spent about 2.5 years in city jail, Rikers Island, and other jails within New York City before I was actually convicted and sentenced to serve out the rest of my time. When you're sentenced, you now have to go upstate New York where you serve the bulk of your time. In that process, you go through a place reception. In this particular case in New York State, it's called Downstate Correctional Facility. And I remember going through a process of where as soon as you get off the bus, and we're chained ankle to ankle, waist to waist, you go into a room, you all face the wall, and officers come in. You can't see who they are because they let you know that you cannot turn around. And they do the same over-the-top cussing and yelling and threatening. The same thing that they did in that museum in Alabama. The thing about this experience was that after that happened, they didn't ship us off to some slave plantation south of the Mason-Dixon line. They sent us upstate to the prison that we would serve out the rest of our time. Whether it be a dime bag of crack cocaine, a gram of meth, or a homicide, prisons are a progeny of the worst brutality committed by humans in our modern history. And we have all been cajoled into believing that prisons are effective systems of rehabilitation in the name of public safety. Lies harm. And the longer lies maintained, the more harm it will cause to everyone who becomes a victim and bystander of the lie. The more we believe that we can't exist without the lie. And dishonesty is a prison of itself, as I spoke about earlier. It is a prison complex. Now, because of the work of black women like Michelle Alexander and Ava DuVernay, we have an easily accessible archive of the racialization of criminal justice in America. And America's prison complex, be clear, is dedicated to maintaining a white racial superiority and the perpetual oppression of the working poor. Here in Texas, the oldest prison in Huntsville, where the first incarcerated people were housed in October of 1849, became a revenue generator for the Confederacy during the Civil War. The cotton and wool produced by the incarcerated people in Huntsville through sales both to the civilian population and the Confederate military units, gross earnings during the war exceeded $1 million, of which $800,000 was deposited in the state treasury as profit. Huntsville was the only prison in the 11 Confederate states that was still standing after the Civil War ended. In 1867, just 2 years after the Civil War concluded, Huntsville became part of the convict lease system to deal with, get this, the increase, and this is the direct quote, to deal with the increase in lawlessness that accompanied the end of the war, which resulted in more persons being sentenced to prison. Who do you think they're speaking about? Could it be a coincidence that Texas has the largest population of any state in America? An honest reckoning of incarceration is understanding, acknowledging, and accepting the truth hidden in plain sight, that prison is a racialized mechanism. It just is, here and in other parts of the world. Over the past year, I've also had the opportunity to do some immersive learning about prisons in other parts of the world. I've visited and conducted workshops in prisons in the Caribbean, South Africa. On a webinar through my Decarcerated platform, I've interviewed formerly incarcerated people in Australia as well as South Africa. In post-apartheid South Africa, the legacy of white racism is illustrated in the creation of townships. In Australia, the indigenous populations have been pushed into what's called missions, the Australian equivalent of townships. And here in the American rendition, we call them projects or inner city ghettos. In some parts of Australia, interesting enough, the juvenile population is 100% indigenous. Think about that. I'll say it again. In some parts of Australia, the juvenile justice population is 100% indigenous. And we know here in America, black or brown skin and poor are prerequisites for incarceration. Just 2 days ago, interesting enough, I had coffee with an Australian colleague who is also indigenous and works within the Australian government. We spoke about the similarities in racial criminalization in the US and Australia. We spoke about how Australians tend not to be, although not black in complexion, as me and many of you in this room, they consider themselves black. She said they have begun to embrace identification, that identification, despite the way it has been used by whites to denigrate them. Black bitch and black bastard are common terms that whites use to describe indigenous folks. Aboriginal women are the fastest growing segment of the prison population in all of Australia. Black women in the United States are the fastest growing segment of the prison population in America. In Montana, for instance, indigenous people comprise approximately just only 6.5% of the prison population, of the state population. Yet they account for 20% of the men in state prisons and 34% of the women in state prison. What I'm imploring you to understand is that prisons do work, in a sense. They are efficient as purveyors of racial injustice and a vehicle to dispose of the poor. Prisons, whether they are brick and mortar structures or communities of despair, they are all designed to break human beings. And when you break humans, humans break other humans. And then we just end up with particles of broken people. So am I a prison abolitionist? Of course I am. But is it practical? Don't we need prison for some people? I'm sure that's a question that people always come up next, and I'm sure probably in this room are probably also thinking. What about the person who shot those students at the University of Charlotte, North Carolina, Tristan Tyrell? The person who committed sexual assault, R. Kelly? Before I answer that, I want to share experience that I had in Cape Town, South Africa. So my background is, so when I came home in 2009, one of the first jobs I had was to work as what's called a violence interrupter. What that was that in my own community of Crown Heights, Brooklyn, I mediated conflicts and built relationships with those people who were most likely to engage in gun violence for the hope of that they would not use any sort of violence to deal with any problems that they had. It was called being a violence interrupter. Since then, it was only 2 programs like that in New York City at the time in 2010. Now in New York, there's about 20 or so programs that have been replicated based on that model. New York City also coincidentally has one of the lowest rates of gun violence in the country. People from the community will never get credit for that. You'll often give credit to law enforcement, who have a role to play without question, but they are not what is driving down people making decisions to not harm themselves and each other. I'm telling you all that history because the way I got access to this, particularly in Johannesburg, is a place called Hanover Park in Cape Town, who sadly has one of the highest rates of gun violence in the country. It's a relatively small, it's probably not bigger than this campus, probably smaller than this campus. And within this campus, within this particular community, there are several rival gangs that are all warring with each other. And what really separates them is really a park, but it's not really a park, it's just a grass field that's really separating these folks. And guess what there's 2 leading gangs and there's 4 like subsidiaries of these gangs. But guess what the 2 leading gangs with their names are called? The Americans and the British. And they tag up, they have, the colors are of the flags of the British and American. It is wild to see and experience. What you see in this image here, on the right-hand side, so myself and a colleague were in this particular part of, in South Africa to speak at a conference that had nothing to do with this. The conference coincidentally was called Global Prisons. But through the networks that I had through that violence interruption program I had spoke to you all about, I was able to gain access to this community. So in this room that you see there in that picture, that is actually in the house of one of the gang leaders. Actually, he's sitting right next to me. And you can't see it, but what's in front of us is literally gates that they've created to protect themselves from other people coming in and harming them. In a way, they've created their own prison to live within. as I was sitting there, another guy, we were talking about the issues in the community, was happening there. And be clear, they were also bragging about some of the violence they had perpetrated. But one of the guys sat next to me, and one of the things he said to me that stood out to me and rings in my ear to this day, he had said, how do you empower people who have no hope? When he said that to me, it made me think about all the communities that I've been to, it made me think about the communities I had been in, it made me think about my own time in prison. See, while he was definitely committing harm, or part of harm, there's no question, there's no way to absolve people of the harm that they are doing, right? I want to hold that out there. But he also, in a very lucid way, understood what he was reacting to. Prisons break, and a part of that breaking is a theft of hope. Without concrete hope, there's only cyclical despair. And how do you feel when you're in despair? As we sit here, and I read on the website of the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work that your mission is to, quote, achieve social, racial, economic, and political justice, local to global. It's an amazing message, and I approve of this message. You have decided that your job is to create justice. Full stop. Nowhere in that vision statement does it say explicitly or implicitly that your conduit to justice is through incarceration or prisons of any kind. Yet the first question most people ask when the idea of prison abolition is brought up is prison abolition practical? Prisons as we understand them in modern times do not always exist, and this is not to say that the modes for dealing with human harm in the past were better. But what I want to drive home is the point that within your vision is an idea that you want to create something new, something you may have never seen. As a practical matter, prison abolition is less about closing actual prisons, more about opening up your mind, skills, and resources to what we can create. Prison abolition is a project of freedom visioning, justice creating with racial, gender, social, and economic equity as a guide. Abolishing our prison complex is dismissing the lie that we should not imagine a world without prisons, that we should not imagine a world without police, that we should not imagine a world without gun violence. Those ideas are not Pollyannish. As social workers, some may be in this room, this is ultimately your job, to be able to envision and dream about things that are not reliant upon solely a law enforcement initiative. You are not law enforcement. Therefore, it's not your job to see human problems through the lens of law enforcement. They have a job to do. You have a different job to do. Your job is to listen to the mission of this graduate program to achieve social, racial, economic, and political justice local to global. As I had said, this coming October will be a year of significant anniversaries for me. It will be my 40th birthday, and I was speaking to somebody here during the break, and when I told her how old I was, she was like, "Get out of here, you look like you're a little kid." And I said, of course, that black don't crack. But as I said before, this is my first like round birthday. You know, you celebrate like your 20th, your 30th, your 40th, your 50th, what have you, right? This is my first time celebrating a birthday of like that nature at home since I was 10. I went to prison at 19, and I came home 2 months past my 30th birthday. This December will also mark 5 years since release from parole. So for a total of 15 years of my life, I've been under some sort of state supervision. In the years since my release, I've co-founded 2 youth programs. One is called HALA, which stands for How Our Lives May Go Together, which works with young people who have been justice involved. And they now go do trainings with other young people around the city. Another youth program that I created was called Youth Organizing to Save Our Streets, which trains young people to be community organizers around issues of gun violence prevention. I've worked in prisons in New York and Virginia, as I mentioned, other places, other countries. I earned another degree, which was mentioned in the bio. I've lectured in some of the best universities in the country, including now here, University of Houston. I've been published in a bunch of places. I've given a TED Talk that have amassed over 1 million views. And I've been able to debate and converse with some of the top elected officials and law enforcement administrators in the country. Without question, I've been very busy. Above all else, I've made my parents and my Brooklyn community proud. I'm thankful. Yet still, Yet still, I stand before you and I say that last year was the worst year of my life since prison. I said before, if I get too personal with you, it's because I care deeply about the work that I do and the people I get to be in community. I get to be in community with everywhere I go. 2 million people in prison is more than a statistic or a meme or a hashtag. It must be and is personal. 2 million people in prison equates to 2 million families. Thousands of people in immigration prisons are thousands of immigrant families. 7 million people under some form of correctional supervision are 7 million families. This is not a criminal justice issue. We are living in an era of the greatest human rights tragedy in the history of humankind. There are over 10 million people in prison all over this world, and 3 million of those people have not been convicted of anything. We are a society of captives and captors. We are a society committed to prisons and the breaking of each other. This is not my issue alone, this is your issue. That last journal entry that I shared with you was my truth at that time. I was aware of what prison was intended to do to me while I was there. I had read Angela Davis early in my sentence. As I said, I earned a college degree while I was there of my own volition and financial resources. But I also experienced officers starving me as a better and more benevolent punishment than going to the box of solitary confinement. I witnessed officers beat the souls out of incarcerated men. I saw incarcerated men beat the souls out of other incarcerated men. I knew people who had no family to call, no visitor list to get approved, nobody to write to. I know people who were clearly mentally unstable, who had no clue why they were in prison. I know people who attempted suicide multiple times, and I know people who succeeded in their attempts. I saw brokenness every day for 3,721 days of my time in prison. And it wasn't until last year that I acknowledged, admitted, accepted that there was no way I could witness so much pillaging of the human psyche without my own soul being broken, even a little. I was scared to admit to the truth that I was one of the human beings that Angela Davis was speaking about. I was one of those human beings that jail and prison broke emotionally. The person I lied to was myself. Prison told me that I was not worthy of love. Prison told me that I would forever be the worst moment of my life. Prison conditioned me to believe that giving trust to anyone required the person to go through a never-ending obstacle course of proving their authenticity to who they say they were. Prison taught me that challenges were a thing to be conquered, not a thing to learn from. Above all else, prison trained me to believe in the concept of incapability. I was incapable of real human connection, and prison taught me that you love through actions and not through heart. I believe wholeheartedly in every one of those lies, and I'm still working my way out of it, actually. But this process is hard. It is the hardest prison I've ever had to learn from because unlike brick and mortar prisons, there's no physical structure to run from, to escape from. There are no visible bars, and there's no deafening sound of cell gates slamming together. The hardest part of this phase of my journey is I have never experienced the type of freedom I am seeking. I had early child life experiences that were precursors to the incarceration I experienced at 19. I've hurt and harmed someone who I love dearly, not because of the lies to her, but because I was committed to the lies I told myself. I was trained to believe about myself, the prison I had created for myself. I brought her into my prison complex, and thankfully she escaped. She wanted no part of it, and I respect her more for realizing that prisons are not the fodder to which sustainable relationships can thrive. Abolishing our prison complex is probably the hardest work we as human beings will have to do. We believe it works for us. We're committed to it. We pledge allegiance to it. Though in plain sight, we are seeing that prisons only create perpetual harm. Mass incarceration has mass casualties. So it boils down to how much are we committed to doing the rigorous work of creating better conditions to heal human beings. The key word here is create. Prison abolitionists from Ruthie Wilson Gilmore to Mariam Makaba, to Angela Davis, all black women, by the way, for generations have been asking us to create different systems to address the actions of broken human beings. Some of those ideas have been the concept of restorative and transformative justice modes. Here's the thing. Abolition our prison concept is a destination that starts with tearing down the carceral thinking that has us trained to believe that we are, as Melissa Harris Perry once told me, incapable of fathoming a world without prisons. 10 million damaged human beings will inevitably infect at least 10 million more. So here's where we can start this hard work. And I often ask people to do this because it requires no sort of, it doesn't require any money, it doesn't require you to go anywhere. It is required to really be in tune with yourself. So next time you watch the news or you scroll through your timeline and you hear about or you read about someone who did some terrible act, I want you to do this, and not what we usually do, which is say that person needs to be hurt themselves, they need to be thrown away in the deepest prison. That's usually our instinctive reaction. It is mine still. What I'm asking you to do is different, is ask yourself a different question. And it's a hard question to ask, because I presume that there are people in this room who have been harmed, people who have had family members who have been harmed. So there's no question when I'm asking this difficult work, but as I explained to you all earlier in my own process, this is some of the hardest work I have ever done. When you watch and you see these things, ask yourself this question. What is it that could have happened in that person's life to cause them to do what they did? Just ask yourself that question. I'm not asking you to actually go do something right away, but just ask yourself, because it's creating a sense of empathy in you that you probably did not know you had. So I'm asking people to, as I spoke about, if you ever seen the TED Talk, check it out, but I'm asking you to really try to experience the depth of your human capacity. It is hard. It's hard. Hell, it's hard to look at the person in the White House and find any empathy for him. But the thing about him, even he's a result of conditioning and the lie that white male mediocrity and entitlement is a standard for leadership, good governance, and intellectual thought. Here's the thing. Several years ago, I worked in an agency, just about now 6-7 years ago, I worked in an organization a criminal justice organization that did work primarily around reentry. So when people were coming home from, no matter what jail they came from, how much time they had, or which crime they were convicted of, they could come to this organization and receive services, whether it be educational support, employment training, and even mental health services. And my job, particularly in this organization, was in policy and advocacy. So I wasn't required to have direct interaction with the people that came into the organization. But being who I am, I interact with people. That's who I was. I care about the youngins. I see them in me, so I always interact with them. One of these particular young people, 19 years old at the time, October of 2013, he was gunned down and killed. And I took it upon myself to visit his family's house, visit his family's house, be able to connect them to resources to pay for the funeral. We also often don't think about like that is you have to find ways to pay to bury this young person, and connect them to resources for that, and connect them to some sort of emotional support services. And I remember going to his funeral, and I've been to sadly a lot of these type of funerals for young people, and you had the boys in the room who had their shades on, and they're like, they want to cry, but they can't act like they want to cry, so they put the shades on, and they do like that gangster cry. And then you have the young girls in the room who are crying, who are showing their emotions, who are more comfortable with showing it. And I remember seeing the pastor at the front of this room, and part of his eulogy, he used an example of a funeral, and when you go and you see a tombstone, and a tombstone, you see the day of person's death to the day they expired, and he focused on the dash in between. And his message, his point was, you have to think about the legacy that you want to create in that dash, right? This young man who was killed, himself was involved with a lot of hurtful things himself, right? As we like, the cliched term, he was no angel himself. But I took the message differently. I looked at Dash and I thought about, and you can think about it too with me. Think about your little son, your daughter, your grandson, your little cousin, your play cousin, your godson, goddaughter, and when you see them as a child, as a little baby, you want to do nothing but kiss and cuddle and tickle and throw them up in the air and say incoherent things because we believe kids understand incoherent words. Which you want to love, and you want to love up on that child, and you see the innocence in that child because that's what they are. And then at some point when they're about 12, 14, 17, 19, they got a mugshot now. They got a bandana on. They're on the street corners. When I think about that Dash, I think about what happened in between that time. Like, how did life impact them that they are now there with that mugshot? That's how I took that message. But we need to be able to look at people in that way. We need to think about harm in that way, right? Not saying that today or tomorrow prisons will close, that people think about abolition, they think about it in that way. Well, you mean close them all tomorrow? Of course not. First of all, you just can't do it. It's not possible to close every prison tomorrow. But it needs to be a destination. We cannot be afraid to say that. We cannot be afraid to say that in any elected or in any city hall. We cannot be afraid to say that in any conversation, any community meeting. We cannot be afraid to say that amongst anybody who may fund this sort of work. It must be a destination. It cannot be that reform is the goal. Reform can be a conduit, but it has to end in the idea of abolition. Because when I think about that Dash, I know that no child, no baby is born to do harmful things. We just aren't. So now I get a little bit closer to the end, and once again, I told you I'm just gonna be a personal talk. I'll tell you all about my business. I'm sure y'all wondering, like, who's he talking about and all this sort of stuff. That's irrelevant to this particular conversation, but I think what is relevant is that when we have these debates, whether it be in the state capitol, in a local community meeting, that these are personal issues. And we need to bring our entire selves into it, but we also understand that prison abolition is ultimately, or the title is called abolishing our prison complexes, it ultimately starts with us abolishing those prisons within ourselves. From being able to see the full capacity of ourselves, to be empathetic, and to love. Because ultimately, the prison complex is built by us. Prisons are an evident display of how we see ourselves as a society. We think that the best way to deal with the worst parts of us is to dash it away. And that's ineffective, and it's not long lasting. Now, I should say this year has started off a little bit better for me, to end up on a better note, a little bit better for me. Back to the eczema thing, I should say that what I've learned, don't worry, I'm not going back to that. I know, like, you gonna go back to that itching stuff again? No, not into those details. But what I did learn about it was that eczema had very little to do with what I was putting on my skin and more about what I was putting into my system. And with that, I understood that, I need to do some things different. I need to drink more water. I've cut out a lot of dairy out of my diet. I don't eat meat as much as I used to. I've realized there's some things I need to do a lot differently as opposed to just putting stuff in those topicals. You see what the topicals do, they might put it away, but it doesn't prevent it from coming back. Prisons can't put away the problems that we have as a society. It can't do it. It will always come. We see it. We see it every day. Ultimately, I'm creating a new relationship with myself. And this relationship is forged in the belief that I am more than what I was taught to believe about myself. Hell, I smile in pictures now. For me, this is creation of a new belief about myself. I sleep better knowing that I no longer hurt others through my former conditioning, and that I am capable of being so much more than the worst moment of my life. Ultimately, I'm constructing a new self-perception. I want us to leave at this point here. Abolition is a concept of creation. Abolition is a concept of creation. What are we putting in place to address the worst of our human possibilities? What are we creating? What community programs are we creating? How are we starting with, are we starting from the beginning and not just focusing on the end? A mentor of mine who passed away several years ago, he was an older gentleman. He had served 25 years in New York State prisons for a crime he did not commit. I'll say his name, his prison name into the room. His name is Eddie Ellis. And he and a couple of men, while they were inside, they had created this document called The Non-Traditional Approach to Social and Criminal Justice. You could Google it, you could find it somewhere online. And there's one quote that I use often that stood out to me from that whole document. And he says, "There are no prison problems. There are only community problems." Now, without question, there are issues that are nuanced to prison. No question about that. But ultimately, what he was saying is that what we're dealing with in prison is that we're dealing with it every day in our communities. And we're not addressing it. We're not addressing that eczema in our communities. We're only trying to put topicals on it. And prison is ultimately just a topical. So I ask you all to just think about this, and I'll leave with this, and this is very important, as I said before. Abolition is an ideology centered in creation, not confinement. Because prisons do not work, and I do not believe in the usefulness of prisons of any kind. Thank you.